I used to think birthdays were small things, quiet markers that didn't need attention. I was wrong. Every year my son forgot mine without fail. No call, no card, no dinner. Yet somehow there was always money, time, and excitement when it came to celebrating his wife's family. Lavish parties, toasts, photos posted everywhere. I watched from the sidelines, learning exactly where I stood in his life. I stayed silent not because it didn't hurt, but because I believed patience would be rewarded. It never was. This time something inside me finally broke, not loudly, not angrily, but clearly. I realized I was done begging for a place at a table where I was never meant to sit, so I made a decision that shocked everyone, including myself. I took every dollar I had, saved every sacrifice I had quietly made over the years, and I chose myself for the first time. I bought a lakefront house, and I didn't explain it to anyone. I didn't ask permission. I simply posted a photo with one short caption that said, "More than years of silence ever could." What happened next exposed my son and his wife in ways I never imagined. The calls, the outrage, the sudden concern that had never existed before. If you think this is just about a forgotten birthday, you're wrong. This is about betrayal that built slowly, humiliation that was disguised as family duty, and a quiet revenge that turned the power dynamic upside down. Stay with me, because the truth that comes out by the end will be more satisfying than any apology they could ever offer. My name is Arthur Bennett. I am 67 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 40 years designing bridges and highways across Colorado. I built structures meant to last generations, yet somehow I failed to build a family that would remember my birthday. The morning of October 14th arrived the same way it had for the past 3 years, in silence. I woke at 6, as I always do, made my coffee black with no sugar, and sat at the kitchen table listening to the house breathe around me. No phone calls, no knocks at the door. No cheerful voices singing off-key while carrying a cake they pretended I did not know about. Just the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting seconds that no longer seemed to matter to anyone but me. I did not bother preparing anything for myself. No special breakfast, no small indulgence, no pretense that this day was different from any other. I learned years ago not to expect celebration. Expectation is just disappointment waiting to happen, and I have had enough disappointment to last several lifetimes. The house felt emptier than usual, though nothing had physically changed. Eleanor's reading chair still sat by the window where morning light used to find her. Her collection of ceramic birds still lined the shelf above the fireplace. Her scent had long faded from the pillows, but I still caught myself turning toward the kitchen, sometimes half expecting to hear her humming while she cooked. 3 years since the cancer took her, and some mornings I still forgot she was gone. When Eleanor was alive, birthdays meant something. Not extravagance, we were never people who needed extravagance, but intention. She would wake early to bake my favorite chocolate cake from her mother's recipe, the one with the frosting that never quite set properly but tasted like heaven anyway. She would put on our wedding song, that old Johnny Mathis record we danced to in our tiny first apartment, and she would hold my hand across the breakfast table and tell me she was grateful for another year together. Simple things, sacred things, things I did not realize were irreplaceable until they were gone. Now there was only the clock ticking, the coffee cooling, the phone silent. Around noon I made the mistake of checking Facebook. I do not use it often. Ryan set up the account years ago so I could see photos of my grandson Tyler, but something compelled me to scroll through that morning. Perhaps loneliness, perhaps masochism. Whatever the reason, I found exactly what I should have expected to find. Vanessa had posted an album titled Mom's Special Day, 47 photographs of an elaborate birthday celebration for her mother Diane. I recognized my son's backyard transformed into something from a magazine: white tents, catered food on silver platters, a 3-tiered cake that probably cost more than my monthly pension, dozens of guests raising champagne glasses, professional decorations in Diane's favorite colors. Ryan stood in several photos, smiling broadly, his arm around his wife as they toasted his mother-in-law like she was royalty. The party had been last weekend, the same weekend as my birthday. I scrolled through every photograph twice, searching for something I knew I would not find. A mention of me, an acknowledgement that their father-in-law had also marked another year of life. There was nothing, not in the captions, not in the comments, not in the dozens of well wishes from friends and family. Arthur Bennett did not exist in that world of champagne and silver platters. I closed the laptop and sat very still for a long time. Later that evening, I found myself standing at my desk, the drawer open, staring at something I had avoided for 3 years. A cream-colored envelope, slightly yellowed now, with my name written in Eleanor's graceful handwriting. Below my name, she had added a single line, "Only open when you truly need to, Arthur. I trust that day will never come. E." She had given it to me 2 weeks before she died, pressing it into my hands with an intensity that surprised me. I assumed it was a love letter, something sentimental for me to treasure after she was gone. I never opened it because I wanted to honor her faith that I would never need whatever was inside. I wanted to believe she was right. I picked up the envelope and felt its weight. Heavier than a single letter. Something else was in there. I looked at Eleanor's photograph on the shelf, then back at the screen of my laptop where Diane's party still glowed in frozen celebration. My son had thrown a lavish party for his mother-in-law, while forgetting his own father existed. Did you know this would happen, Eleanor? Did you see what I refused to see? That question haunted me through the sleepless night that followed my birthday, and it continued to echo in my mind for days afterward. The more I thought about it, the more I realized Eleanor had tried to tell me many things I refused to hear. 6 months before she died, when the cancer had already begun its slow theft of her strength, Eleanor said something I dismissed too quickly. We were sitting on the back porch watching the sunset, one of those golden Colorado evenings that made you believe the world was still beautiful despite everything. She had been quiet for a long time, her hand resting in mine, her breathing shallow but steady. Then she spoke without looking at me. "Arthur, I need you to promise me something." I squeezed her hand. "Anything. Watch yourself around Vanessa. She looks at you like you're temporary, like you're just in the way of something she's waiting for." I remember laughing softly, not cruelly, but with the gentle dismissal of a husband who thought he understood his wife's fears better than she did. "Eleanor, that's the illness talking. You're tired and your mind is playing tricks. Vanessa is difficult sometimes, but she's Ryan's wife. She's family." Eleanor turned to look at me then, and her eyes held something I could not name. Sadness, yes, but also something sharper. Frustration, perhaps. Or resignation. "I'm not confused, Arthur. I'm dying, which means I see things more clearly than I ever have. Promise me you'll be careful." I promised because she needed to hear it, not because I believed her. I told myself the medication was affecting her thoughts, that fear of leaving me alone was manifesting as suspicion toward our daughter-in-law. I patted her hand and changed the subject, and Eleanor let me because she was too weak to argue. But she never brought it up again, and now I wonder if that silence was defeat or simply patience. Perhaps she knew I would have to learn the truth myself. In her final weeks, Eleanor did something I never understood until recently. She met with Samuel Brooks multiple times, sometimes for hours. Samuel had been our family attorney for 30 years, a steady and trustworthy man who handled our wills and property matters with quiet competence. I assumed Eleanor was updating her own will, making sure everything was in order before she passed. When I asked about the meetings, she smiled in that mysterious way she had and said, "Women's business. Don't worry." I never pressed further. Eleanor was dying, and if meeting with Samuel brought her peace, I would not question it. Now I realize how much that smile must have cost her, to carry whatever knowledge she carried to prepare for something she could not share with me, to trust that I would eventually find my way to the truth she left behind. 2 weeks after my forgotten birthday, I received an invitation to a family dinner at Ryan's house. The invitation came through text message, not from my son but from Vanessa, and the wording made clear this was an obligation rather than a welcome. Dinner Sunday at 6. Try to be on time. No pleasantries, no warmth, just instructions delivered like a memo to an employee. I went anyway. Part of me still hoped things might be different, that perhaps they had realized their oversight and wanted to make amends. That hope died the moment I walked through the door. Diane Collins sat at the head of the table, the position Eleanor once occupied when we hosted holidays in our home. Vanessa had arranged the seating with surgical precision, her mother in the place of honor, herself at Diane's right hand, Ryan beside his wife, and me at the far corner, practically in the hallway leading to the kitchen. The table could seat 12 comfortably, and I was positioned as far from the center of conversation as physically possible. Throughout dinner, Vanessa controlled everything. She decided when dishes were passed, and to whom. She steered every conversation toward topics that excluded me: vacation plans. I was not part of social events I had not been invited to, inside jokes that required context I did not possess. Whenever I tried to speak, she would talk over me or redirect attention elsewhere with practiced ease. I watched my son through all of this. Ryan sat with his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes fixed on his plate whenever his wife spoke. Not once during the entire meal did he make eye contact with me. When I asked him directly about his work, he gave a 3-word answer and immediately looked to Vanessa as if seeking permission to continue. She did not grant it, instead launching into a story about her mother's recent trip to Santa Fe. After dessert, I excused myself to use the bathroom. On my way back, I stopped in the hallway when I heard voices from the kitchen. Vanessa and Ryan speaking in low tones they assumed I could not hear. "He sat there like a ghost the whole meal," Vanessa said. "It's exhausting having to include him in everything." "He's my father," Ryan replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "And your father needs to understand his place. This is our house now, our family. He had his turn. Now it's ours, and the sooner he accepts that, the easier things will be for everyone." Ryan said nothing in response. Not a word of defense, not a syllable of protest. Just silence, which Vanessa seemed to take as agreement. I returned to the dining room on unsteady legs, made my excuses about feeling tired, and drove home through a blur of streetlights and unanswered questions. When I walked through my front door, the first thing I saw was Eleanor's photograph on the mantel, her smile gentle and knowing in the soft lamplight. I stood before her for a long moment, remembering her warning on that golden evening, remembering her mysterious meetings with Samuel, remembering all the things I had been too stubborn or too trusting to see. "You tried to tell me," I whispered to her image. "What else did you see that I didn't?" The answer to that question came not from Eleanor's photograph, but from a cardboard box I had avoided for years. The morning after that miserable dinner, I found myself pulling boxes from the closet in my study, searching for something I could not quite name. I told myself I was organizing old papers, clearing clutter, doing the practical work of a man putting his affairs in order. But somewhere deeper, I knew I was looking for evidence. Evidence of what I was not yet certain. I found it in a faded manila folder labeled Ryan House in Eleanor's neat handwriting. Inside were documents I had not reviewed in a decade, mortgage applications, co-signer agreements, bank statements, and a small note Eleanor had written to herself that I had never seen before. But before I read her note, I let myself remember how it all began. 10 years ago, Ryan came to us with excitement in his voice and desperation in his eyes. He and Vanessa had found their dream home, a 4-bedroom colonial in a good school district, perfect for the family they planned to start. The problem was the bank. Ryan's income as a mid-level sales manager was not enough to qualify for the mortgage on his own, and Vanessa's freelance work was too inconsistent to count. They needed a co-signer, someone with stable income and good credit to guarantee the loan. Ryan asked me over dinner, his words tumbling out in a rush of promises. "It's just a formality, Dad. The bank needs a name on paper, that's all. We'll make every payment ourselves. You won't have to do anything except sign." I wanted to say yes immediately. What father would not want to help his son build a home for his family? But Eleanor's hand found mine under the table, her grip firm with warning. Later that night, after Ryan and Vanessa had left, she told me exactly what she thought. "If you do this, Arthur, they'll never see it as a gift. They'll see it as an obligation you owed them. Something they were entitled to, not something you sacrificed." I shook my head. "You're being too hard on them. He's our son. This is what parents do." "Parents help," Eleanor said. "Parents don't become financial hostages. A co-signer isn't just a signature, Arthur. It's a promise. If they can't pay, you pay. If they default, your credit is destroyed. You're putting everything we've built at risk for people who have never once said thank you for anything we've given them." She was talking about Vanessa. I knew, though, she was careful not to say the name directly. Eleanor had noticed things about our daughter-in-law long before I did: the way Vanessa accepted gifts without acknowledgement, the way she spoke about our family home as though calculating its future value, the way she looked past me when I talked as if I were already fading. Relevance. But I was stubborn and I was proud, and I believed my son would never let me down. I signed the co-signer agreement the following week. Eleanor attended the closing with me, her face a careful mask of neutrality, and she never mentioned her objections again. Some battles, she once told me, have to be lost before they can be understood. The first few years, Ryan made the payments as promised. Then came the excuses. The economy was difficult. His company had restructured. Vanessa's clients had dried up. Could I help with just one payment? Just until things stabilized, I agreed, of course. One payment became 2, then 6, then a standing arrangement that no one ever formally acknowledged. I set up an automatic transfer of $800 every month from my account to theirs, enough to cover their shortfall, enough to keep the mortgage current, enough to prevent the default that would have destroyed my credit rating along with theirs. Now, sitting on my study floor surrounded by old documents, I did the math I had avoided for a decade. $800 per month for 10 years. $96,000. I had paid nearly $100,000 toward a house where I was seated in the corner, like an unwanted guest, spoken about in kitchens like a burden to be managed, forgotten on birthdays, while my daughter-in-law's mother received champagne toasts. I pulled out my current bank statements and pension records, forcing myself to look at numbers I had willfully ignored. The $800 came from my pension, and after Eleanor died, from the life insurance money she had left me. Money she had saved and sacrificed for money meant to secure my final years, and I had been funneling it to people who treated me like I was already dead. Then I found Eleanor's note tucked behind the mortgage documents in her handwriting. It was dated 3 months before she passed, and it contained only 2 sentences: "He's still paying. They've never said thank you." She knew. Even as she was dying, she knew I was still covering for Ryan, still sacrificing, still waiting for gratitude that would never come. She documented it not as accusation, but as evidence, a quiet record of a truth I was not ready to face. I sat back against the closet door and stared at the ceiling. $96,000 over 10 years. 20 years remaining on the 30-year mortgage. At this rate, I would pay another $192,000 before the loan was satisfied, assuming I lived that long, assuming my savings held out, assuming the people living in that house continued to treat my contributions as their birthright. The payments were automatic, invisible, expected. Not once in a decade had Ryan called to say thank you. Not once had Vanessa acknowledged that the roof over her head existed partly because of my signature and my money. The sacrifice had become so routine that it had ceased to exist in their minds, if it ever existed at all. They don't even know I'm keeping their house afloat, I thought. Or maybe they do, and they just don't care. That realization sat heavy in my chest through the weeks that followed, a stone I carried everywhere but showed to no one. I continued my routines, continued my automatic payments, continued pretending that things might somehow change. Then Christmas arrived, and whatever fragile hope I had been nursing finally shattered beyond repair. I spent 3 weeks choosing gifts for the family. Not expensive things, my draining savings could not support extravagance, but thoughtful things. For Tyler, my 16-year-old grandson, I found a vintage compass like the one my own father gave me when I was his age, along with a book about famous explorers that I inscribed with a personal message. For Ryan, I chose a leather journal and a fountain pen, remembering how he used to love writing stories as a boy before life, and Vanessa redirected his ambitions. For Vanessa, despite everything, I selected a beautiful scarf in colors I had seen her admire because I was still foolish enough to believe that kindness might soften her. I wrapped each gift carefully, using the same plaid paper Eleanor had always favored, and I drove to Ryan's house on Christmas morning with something almost like optimism warming my chest. The snow was falling lightly, the streets were quiet, and for a few precious minutes I allowed myself to imagine a different kind of gathering. One where my presence mattered, one where my gifts would be received with genuine appreciation, one where I was still part of a family rather than a ghost haunting its edges. The reality announced itself the moment I walked through the door. Diane was already installed in the living room like a queen holding court, surrounded by a mountain of elaborately wrapped packages that Vanessa was distributing with theatrical enthusiasm. "This one's from your favorite daughter," Vanessa cooed, handing her mother a box that clearly contained jewelry. "And this one, and this one. Mom, you're going to be opening gifts all day." I set my modest offerings on a side table near the door. Vanessa glanced at them, once registered their presence with the faintest flicker of acknowledgement, and returned her attention to her mother without a word. My gifts sat untouched for the next 2 hours while Diane unwrapped present after present to choruses of admiration. A cashmere sweater exquisite, a spa weekend how thoughtful, a designer handbag simply perfect. Each gift was photographed, praised, and displayed as evidence of Vanessa's devotion to her mother. My packages remained on the side table, still wrapped, gradually buried under discarded coats and scarves, as other guests arrived. The extended family gathered for dinner, perhaps 15 people crowded around a table meant for 12. I found myself seated at the far end again, near a cousin of Vanessa's I had never met, separated from my own son and grandson by a wall of bodies and conversation that did not include me. I tried several times to join discussions to offer thoughts on topics being debated, but my voice seemed to vanish before reaching anyone's ears. People talked over me or through me as though I were not there. Then Vanessa delivered her masterstroke. The conversation had turned to politics, a subject I follow closely and discuss with reasonable intelligence. I was offering my perspective on a recent policy decision when Vanessa cut across me with a bright, pitying smile. "Arthur, why don't you rest in the other room? These conversations are a bit much for someone your age. There's a nice quiet chair by the fireplace where you can relax." The table fell silent. 15 faces turned toward me with expressions ranging from discomfort to barely concealed amusement. I am 67 years old, sharp as I have ever been capable of calculating structural loads in my head and remembering details from engineering projects decades past. But in that moment I was being dismissed like a confused old man who had wandered into a room where he did not belong. I looked to Ryan, my son, my only child, the boy I had raised and supported and sacrificed nearly $100,000 to house. He was studying his shoes with intense concentration, his jaw tight, his hands gripping his napkin like a lifeline. "Ryan," I said quietly. He glanced up briefly, then away. "She didn't mean it like that, Dad." But she did. We both knew she did. And his refusal to defend me, his immediate retreat into excuse-making, told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties had settled. I excused myself to use the bathroom, though what I really needed was airspace a moment away from the suffocating weight of my own irrelevance. I walked down the hallway toward the guest bathroom, moving slowly, trying to compose myself. That is when I heard the voices from the front hall just around the corner where Vanessa and Diane stood, speaking in tones they assumed were private. "Don't worry, Mom," Vanessa was saying. "When the old man's gone, we'll finally have everything. It's just a matter of time. He's 67 and alone. How much longer can he really last?" Diane's response was a soft laugh. "You've always been such a planner, sweetheart." I stood frozen in the hallway, one hand against the wall to steady myself. The words echoed in my skull like hammer blows. "When the old man's gone. Just a matter of time. How much longer can he really last?" They were not waiting for me to die. They were counting on it, planning for it, treating my death as an inevitability that would finally deliver them whatever they believed I was keeping from them. I did not confront them. I did not raise my voice or demand explanations or cause a scene that would only be twisted later into evidence of my instability. I simply walked back to the living room, retrieved my coat from the pile that had buried my unopened gifts, and let myself out the front door without saying goodbye to anyone. The drive home passed in silence. No radio, no phone calls, no tears. Just the sound of tires on wet pavement and the slow crystallization of something that had been forming in my chest for years. When I finally pulled into my driveway and sat in the darkness of my garage, I spoke aloud for the first time in hours. No more waiting. No more hoping. It's time to find out what I'm really worth to them. The next morning, I began the work of understanding exactly how trapped I was. I called a financial advisor I had never used before, a woman named Patricia Holloway, whose office was across town from anyone who might know me or my family. I wanted professional eyes on my situation, eyes unclouded by personal history or assumptions about who I was supposed to be. Patricia was in her 50s, efficient, and direct, the kind of person who delivered hard truths without apology. I appreciated that immediately. I showed her the mortgage documents, the co-signer agreement, my bank statements showing a decade of payments. She reviewed everything in silence, her reading glasses perched on her nose, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with something close to sympathy. "Mr. Bennett, I need to make sure you understand your legal position here. As a co-signer on this mortgage, you are not a helper or a guarantor in the casual sense. You are equally liable for the entire debt. If your son stops paying tomorrow, the bank will come after you for the full remaining balance. Your credit, your assets, your retirement savings, all of it is on the line." I had known this intellectually, of course, but hearing it stated so plainly in a stranger's office with fluorescent lights humming overhead made the reality settle into my bones in a new way. "Can I remove my name from the loan?" Patricia shook her head. "Co-signers cannot unilaterally withdraw from a mortgage agreement. There are only 3 ways out. First, your son could refinance the loan independently, qualifying on his own income and credit without your involvement. Second, the loan could be paid off in full. Third, the house could be sold and the mortgage satisfied from the proceeds. Short of one of those 3 options, you are legally bound to this debt until it is resolved. For how long? She glanced at her notes. The original loan was a 30-year mortgage. 10 years have passed. You are potentially liable for another 20 years, assuming no early payoff or sale. 20 years. I would be 87 years old before this obligation ended, assuming I lived that long. The weight of that number pressed down on my chest like a physical force. I had signed a single document a decade ago trying to help my son, and I had chained myself to his financial decisions for the rest of my natural life. Patricia offered some suggestions, talking to Ryan about refinancing, consulting an attorney about my options, reviewing whether my continued payments might give me any leverage. I thanked her, paid her consultation fee, and drove home with my mind churning through possibilities I had never allowed myself to consider. That evening, I sat in my study with the phone in my hand for nearly an hour before I finally dialed the number. Samuel Brooks answered on the third ring, his voice the same steady baritone I remembered from decades of legal consultations and the quiet months after Eleanor's funeral. "Arthur," he said, and something in his tone suggested he had been expecting this call. "It's been a long time. 3 years," I said. "I should have called sooner." "No," Samuel replied. "You're calling exactly when you were meant to. Eleanor told me you would reach out when you were ready. She was very specific about that." I felt a chill travel down my spine. "What do you mean she told you?" There was a pause on the line, the kind of weighted silence that precedes important revelations. "Eleanor left something with me before she died. She made me promise not to give it to you until you decided to stand up for yourself. Until you stop making excuses for people who don't deserve your loyalty." Her words, not mine. My hand tightened on the phone. "What did she leave? I think you need to come see me in person." "This isn't a phone conversation. Samuel, please. Just tell me what it is." Another pause. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, more serious than I had ever heard it. "It's a box, Arthur. Documents, recordings, her own written observations. She spent the last months of her life preparing it, working on it during the time she told you she was resting. She knew things, Arthur. Things she couldn't tell you directly because she knew you wouldn't believe her. You loved your son too much to see what she saw." I closed my eyes, remembering Eleanor's mysterious meetings with Samuel, her warnings about Vanessa, that I had dismissed as anxiety, the strange intensity with which she had pressed that sealed envelope into my hands. She had not been confused or frightened or grasping at straws. She had been preparing, building something, leaving me armor for a battle she knew I would eventually have to fight. "Why didn't she just tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because you weren't ready to hear it. She knew you, Arthur. She knew you would defend Ryan until the evidence was undeniable, until you had seen the truth with your own eyes. She said you needed to reach the breaking point on your own before you would be willing to see what she had gathered." I thought about the Christmas party, the overheard conversation, the calculation in Vanessa's voice as she discussed waiting for my death. Eleanor had predicted this. She had known it would come to something like this, and she had prepared accordingly, leaving me tools I did not know existed until I was desperate enough to need them. "When can I come see you?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. My office." Samuel paused, then added, "Arthur, your wife knew things. She prepared for this moment in ways you cannot imagine. The question is, are you ready to see what she saw?" I looked at Eleanor's photograph across the room, her gentle smile holding secrets I was only beginning to understand. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready." The morning after my conversation with Samuel, before I could make the drive to his office, I forced myself to sit down with a calculator and face the full truth of my finances. If I was going to stand up for myself, as Eleanor apparently knew I would need to, I had to understand exactly what resources I possessed and what options they afforded me. The numbers were both better and worse than I expected. My pension provided a steady monthly income that covered my basic expenses with modest room to spare. Eleanor's life insurance, minus the $96,000 I had already funneled to Ryan's mortgage, had left me with approximately $180,000 in savings. Not a fortune by any measure, but enough. Enough to buy a modest home outright somewhere far from Colorado. Somewhere I could start fresh, without the constant reminder of everything I had lost and everyone who had forgotten me. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a different life. Not the life I had planned with Eleanor growing old together in the house where we raised our son, but something new. Something built on my own terms, rather than obligations to people who saw me as temporary, as an obstacle, as someone whose death would finally deliver them whatever they believed they deserved. I began searching online for properties in places I had never considered before. Maine, upstate New York, Vermont. States with seasons and quiet towns and distances measured in days rather than hours from my son's house. I was not running away, I told myself. I was running toward something, though I could not yet name what that something might be. A listing in Vermont caught my attention. A small cottage on a lake, 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace surrounded by maple trees that the photographs showed blazing red and gold in autumn. The price was within my budget. The location was a full day's drive from anyone who knew my name or my history. Something about the photographs stirred a feeling I barely recognized any more possibility. I called the realtor that afternoon and scheduled a viewing for the following week. Then I drove to Samuel's office as planned, but that meeting and what it revealed would have to settle in my mind before I could act on it. First, I needed to see this cottage. I needed to know if the peace I imagined was real or just another fantasy I was constructing to survive. The drive to Vermont took 12 hours. I split it over 2 days, stopping at a roadside motel that smelled of pine cleaner and old cigarettes, sleeping better than I had in months, despite the unfamiliar bed. Something about moving about, putting miles between myself and the life that had shrunk around me, felt like medicine I had not known I needed. The cottage was everything the photographs promised and more. It sat at the end of a gravel road, perhaps 50 yards from a lake, so still it mirrored the sky like polished glass. The trees were bare in early January, but I could imagine them full and green, could picture myself sitting on the small wooden dock, watching seasons change without anyone expecting anything from me. The interior was simple, worn hardwood floors, a kitchen that needed updating, bedrooms barely large enough for their furniture, but clean and solid and quiet, so wonderfully quiet. I was standing on the dock watching my breath cloud in the cold air when I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. I turned to find a woman approaching, perhaps 65, with silver hair pulled back in a practical braid and a kind face weathered by years of outdoor living. She wore a heavy cardigan over jeans and carried herself with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in her own skin. "You must be the one looking at the Patterson place," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Maggie Lewis. I live next door, if you can call a quarter mile away next door." I shook her hand, introducing myself, and we fell into the easy conversation of strangers who recognized something familiar in each other. Maggie was a widow, I learned, 5 years now. She had moved to Vermont after her husband passed, leaving behind a life in Connecticut that had become unbearable. "My children didn't understand why I left," she said, gazing out at the frozen lake. "Or maybe they understood too well. My daughter-in-law told everyone I was crazy, that I couldn't be trusted to make my own decisions anymore. She tried to have me declared incompetent, if you can believe that. I could believe it more easily than she knew. The worst part," Maggie continued, her voice dropping, "was what she said about my husband. She claimed he told her before he died that he wanted her to have everything, that he didn't trust me to manage the estate properly. Complete fabrication. Richard never said any such thing. But he was gone, so who could contradict her?" I listened without speaking, feeling a strange tightness in my chest that I could not explain. Maggie turned to look at me directly. "The worst lies aren't the ones people tell about you, Mr. Bennett. They're the ones they tell using the dead, because the dead can't defend themselves. They can't stand up and say, 'No, that's not what I meant, that's not who I was.' The dead are just tools for the living to use however they please." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the January air. I thought of Vanessa invoking Eleanor's name, claiming promises my wife had never made, and suddenly Maggie's words felt less like a stranger's story and more like a warning I was not yet equipped to understand. "I'm sorry," I said. "That must have been painful." Maggie smiled, but her eyes held depths I recognized. "It was, but I survived it. And now I have this." She gestured at the lake, the trees, the quiet. "Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what you actually need." I drove back to Colorado with Maggie's words echoing in my mind, her warning about the dead being used as tools by the living. The 12-hour journey felt shorter than before, perhaps, because my thoughts were so consumed with what awaited me at Samuel's office that I barely noticed the passing landscape. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made 2 decisions. I would see Samuel first thing in the morning, and I would make an offer on the Vermont cottage regardless of what he revealed to me. Samuel's office occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building downtown, the same location where he had practiced law for over 40 years. The waiting room smelled of old leather and paper, comforting scents that reminded me of the countless times Eleanor and I had sat in these chairs reviewing wills and property documents, planning for a future we assumed would unfold according to our careful designs. How naive we had been. His secretary showed me in promptly at 9. Samuel rose from behind his desk, older than I remembered, his hair fully white now, and his movements slower but his eyes still sharp with intelligence. On the desk between us sat a wooden box, perhaps the size of a shoebox, made of dark walnut with brass hinges. Beside it lay a cream-colored envelope, identical to the one Eleanor had given me before she died. "Sit down, Arthur," Samuel said, his voice gentle but serious. "We have things to discuss." I sat, my eyes fixed on the box. "Is that what she left?" Samuel nodded. "Eleanor gave this to me 2 weeks before she passed. She was very specific about the instructions. I was to keep it safe, tell no one about its existence, and give it to you only when you came to me of your own accord, ready to face something difficult. She said you would know when to open it." I reached out and touched the wood, smooth and cool beneath my fingers. "What's inside?" "I don't know the full contents. She sealed it herself. But she told me enough for me to understand the purpose." Samuel leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "She came to me because she didn't trust certain people in your life, Arthur. She never named names directly, but I understood who she meant. She asked me to help her leave you protection." Those were her exact words. Protection. Protection from what? Samuel's expression grew more somber. From what she saw coming, from the things she believed would happen after she was gone. Eleanor was dying, but her mind was sharper than ever. She spent her final months observing, documenting, preparing. I helped her with some legal aspects, notarizing certain documents, verifying information she had gathered. I didn't fully understand the scope of what she was doing until later, after the funeral, when I reviewed everything she had entrusted to me. I stared at the box, feeling its weight even before I lifted it. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because she made me promise not to. She knew you, Arthur. She said you would defend Ryan and make excuses for Vanessa until you had no choice but to see the truth. She said if I gave you this box too early, you would dismiss it as paranoia or grief or a dying woman's confusion. You needed to reach the breaking point yourself." Samuel paused. "Have you reached it?" I thought of Christmas dinner, the overheard conversation, the calculation in Vanessa's voice. I thought of $96,000 paid into a house where I was treated like a ghost. I thought of my forgotten birthday and Diane's champagne celebration. "Yes," I said, "I've reached it." Samuel slid the box and envelope across the desk toward me. "Then these are yours now. Open them when you're ready. There's no rush. What's inside has waited 3 years. It can wait a little longer if you need time." I took the box and held it in my lap, feeling something shift inside when I moved it. Papers, perhaps, or something heavier. "Thank you, Samuel, for keeping this, for keeping her trust." "Eleanor was a remarkable woman," he said simply. "She loved you more than you probably knew." I left his office with the box wrapped in a cloth bag, feeling as though I carried something precious and dangerous, a gift and a burden all at once. When I arrived home, I set it on my desk and sat staring at it for nearly an hour, running my fingers over the brass hinges, testing the weight of decisions not yet made. Instead of opening it, I made a phone call. The realtor in Vermont answered on the second ring, and I told her I wanted to make an offer on the lakefront cottage. Full asking price, cash purchase, no contingencies. She sounded surprised but pleased, promising to submit the paperwork immediately. When she asked for my mailing address for the documents, I gave her Samuel's office instead of my own. The fewer people who knew about this, the better. When I hung up, I felt something unfamiliar settling into my chest. Not happiness exactly, but a sense of forward motion. For the first time in years, I was making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what others expected of me. The cottage would be mine, a place no one else knew about, a refuge built entirely on my own terms. That night, after a simple dinner eaten in silence, I sat in my armchair with Eleanor's box in my lap. The house was quiet except for the familiar ticking of the grandfather clock, counting seconds toward a future I could not yet see. I ran my fingers over the smooth walnut, feeling the grain of the wood, imagining Eleanor's hands touching this same surface as she packed whatever she had gathered inside. "What did you see, Eleanor?" I whispered to the empty room. "What were you protecting me from?" I almost opened it then. My fingers found the brass latch, lifted it slightly, felt the lid begin to separate from the base, but something held me back. Fear, perhaps, or respect for the magnitude of what I was about to discover. Eleanor had spent the final weeks of her life building this box, gathering its contents, preparing me for a moment she knew would come. I owed her more than a hasty opening, driven by impatience. I set the box aside, still sealed, and looked at her photograph on the mantel. "Not yet," I said softly. But soon. The closing on the Vermont cottage happened 3 weeks later, conducted entirely through Samuel's office to maintain my privacy. I signed the final documents on a gray February morning, my hand steady despite the magnitude of what I was doing. $162,000 transferred from my savings to purchase a home no one in my family knew existed. When the last signature was complete and the keys were placed in my palm, I felt something I had not experienced in decades. The terrifying, exhilarating weight of a decision made entirely for myself. For 40 years, every major choice I made had been filtered through obligation. What did Eleanor need? What would help Ryan? What would keep the family stable, functional together? Even my career decisions had been shaped by responsibility, taking promotions I did not want because they paid better, declining opportunities that might have fulfilled me because they required risk. I had built my entire adult life around the needs of others. And while I did not regret the love that motivated those choices, I was only now beginning to understand what I had sacrificed in the process. The cottage was mine. Not mine, and Eleanor's not mine to pass down to Ryan. Not mine with strings attached. Just mine. A place where I could sit by a lake and watch seasons change without anyone expecting anything from me. The terror came from the unfamiliarity of such freedom. The liberation came from the same source. That evening I did something impulsive, perhaps even reckless. I logged into Facebook, the account I rarely used, and uploaded a photograph I had taken during my visit to Vermont. The cottage in late afternoon light, the lake stretching silver behind it, bare trees reaching toward a winter sky. I studied the image for a long moment, then typed a caption I had been composing in my mind for weeks. 67 years old. First home I bought just for myself. Happy birthday to me. No tags, no explanation, no mention of Vermont or moving or starting over. Just the photograph and those 13 words offered to the digital world without context or apology. I pressed the share button before I could reconsider, then closed the laptop and went to bed. By morning, the post had transformed into something I never anticipated. 73 comments from people I had not spoken to in years. Former colleagues from the engineering firm, neighbors from decades past, distant relatives whose faces I could barely remember. The messages overflowed with warmth and encouragement. "Good for you, Arthur. It's never too late for a fresh start. Eleanor would be so proud of you. Independence looks beautiful on you." I read each comment with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. These people, many of whom I had lost touch with entirely, were celebrating a decision my own son and daughter-in-law would undoubtedly condemn. The contrast was almost too painful to contemplate. The phone calls began around noon. Ryan's name appeared on my screen, disappeared, appeared again. 4 calls in the first hour, each one sent to voicemail. I did not listen to the messages. I already knew what they would contain: confusion, accusation, demands for explanation disguised as concern. The text messages started shortly after. Vanessa, not Ryan. Of course it was Vanessa. Her texts arrived in rapid succession, each one more demanding than the last. "Arthur, what is this post about? Call us immediately. Ryan is very upset. You owe us an explanation. Where did you get the money for this? We need to talk right now." I read each message as it arrived, watching my screen light up with her increasing agitation. There was something almost satisfying about her panic, though I felt guilty for that satisfaction. She was not worried about me. She was worried about what my independence meant for whatever plans she had been making. The final text arrived just before sunset, and it stripped away any pretense of concern or family feeling. "You need to explain yourself. That money belongs to this family. Call me back immediately." I stared at those words for a long time. That money belongs to this family. Not "we're worried about you" or "please help us understand." Just naked entitlement, the assumption that my savings, my pension, my dead wife's life insurance were communal property to which Vanessa had some inherent claim. She had finally said plainly what she had always believed, that I was merely a temporary custodian of resources that rightfully belonged to her. I set down the phone and looked across the room to where Eleanor's box still sat on my desk, unopened, waiting. 3 weeks I had circled around it, finding reasons to delay, telling myself I needed more time. But Vanessa's text had clarified something I should have understood from the beginning. The time for waiting was over. I walked to the desk, sat down, and pulled the box toward me. The brass latch was cool beneath my fingers. Now I whispered to Eleanor's photograph. Now I'm ready. Before I could lift the lid, headlights swept across my front window. A car door slammed in the driveway, followed by footsteps on the porch and a pounding at my door that shook the frame. I did not need to check the peephole to know who had arrived. Vanessa stood on my doorstep, her face flushed with anger, her designer coat hanging open as though she had thrown it on without thought. Behind her in the driveway, her car sat with the engine still running, the driver's door left ajar. She had driven 45 minutes in the dark, apparently too furious to waste time on proper parking. "We need to talk," she said, pushing past me into the house before I could respond. "Right now." I closed the door slowly, taking a breath to steady myself. Eleanor's box would have to wait a little longer. "Would you like to sit down?" "I don't want to sit down. I want to know what you think you're doing." She stood in the middle of my living room, arms crossed, radiating hostility. "That Facebook post. That house. Where did the money come from, Arthur? How dare you make a decision like this without consulting the family?" I remained by the door, keeping distance between us. I wasn't aware I needed permission to spend my own savings. "Your savings," she laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "That money was supposed to be for Ryan. For us. For your grandchild. You don't get to just disappear with it and buy yourself some vacation home while your family struggles." "Struggles," I repeated quietly. "Your house has 4 bedrooms and a 3-car garage. You take vacations to Europe. Your mother receives birthday parties with catered food and professional decorations. What exactly are you struggling with, Vanessa?" Her eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare turn this around on me. You're being selfish, Arthur. Unbelievably selfish. After everything we've done for you, after all the years we've included you in our lives, this is how you repay us." I said nothing. My silence seemed to infuriate her more than any argument could have. "Eleanor would be ashamed of you," Vanessa continued, her voice rising. "She would be absolutely ashamed to see you abandoning your family like this. She always said family came first. She always believed in taking care of each other." The mention of Eleanor's name sent a cold current through my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. "Did she?" "Yes, she did. And she would never have approved of you running off to spend money that should go to your son." Vanessa took a step closer, her finger jabbing toward me. "My mother told me that Eleanor promised everything would go to Ryan. She made that commitment years ago. You're betraying your own wife's wishes." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood completely still, processing what she had just said. Eleanor promised everything would go to Ryan, my mother told me. In 43 years of marriage, Eleanor never once discussed leaving everything to Ryan. We had made our wills together, reviewed them regularly, talked openly about how our assets would be distributed after we were gone. There was no secret promise, no private commitment made behind my back. Eleanor told me everything. She shared every thought, every worry, every hope for our future. If she had made such a promise, I would have known, which meant Vanessa was lying. Not exaggerating or misremembering, but deliberately lying, using my dead wife's name to justify her greed. And she had learned this lie from Diane, which meant they had been fabricating this narrative together perhaps for years, waiting for the right moment to deploy it. Maggie's words from Vermont echoed in my mind. "The worst lies aren't the ones people tell about you. They're the ones they tell using the dead, because the dead can't defend themselves." Eleanor had tried to warn me. She had seen something in Vanessa that I refused to see. And now, standing in my living room, Vanessa had finally revealed exactly what my wife had known all along. I looked at her steadily, and when I spoke, my voice was ice. "Vanessa, my wife never made any such promise. I was married to her for 43 years. I knew every thought in her head. She told me everything, shared everything, trusted me with everything. Not once in 4 decades did she ever suggest that all our assets should go exclusively to Ryan. Not once." Vanessa opened her mouth to interrupt, but I continued, my voice dropping lower. "So I'll ask you once, and I expect an honest answer. Who told you to lie about a dead woman? Who convinced you that you could use Eleanor's name to manipulate me into giving you what you want?" The color drained from Vanessa's face. For the first time since I had known her, she had no quick response, no deflection, no manipulation ready to deploy. She stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, caught in a lie she had never expected me to challenge. "I think I said quietly, it's time for you to leave." Vanessa left without another word, her tires screeching on the pavement as she reversed out of my driveway. I watched her headlights disappear into the darkness and knew that the confrontation was far from over. She would regroup, strategize, rally reinforcements. Whatever came next would be planned and coordinated, designed to overwhelm me with numbers and accusations until I surrendered. The summons came 3 days later. Ryan called, his voice stiff and formal, to request my presence at a family meeting. "Vanessa thinks we all need to talk," he said. "Clear the air. Work through some things." I could hear the rehearsal in his words, the careful phrasing someone else had provided. He did not sound like my son. He sounded like a messenger. I agreed to come. I had been waiting for this. The meeting was held at Ryan's house in the living room, where I had been seated in corners and talked over and dismissed for years. When I arrived, Vanessa and Diane were already positioned on the main sofa like generals, preparing for battle. Ryan sat in an armchair to the side, his posture tense, his eyes avoiding mine. The arrangement was deliberate, 2 against 1, with Ryan as the uncertain territory they expected to control. Diane spoke first, her voice dripping with rehearsed concern. "Arthur, we're all very worried about you. This sudden decision to buy a house, the way you've been isolating yourself, the hostility toward Vanessa, it's not like you. We think perhaps you're not thinking clearly. We're concerned about your mental state," Vanessa added, picking up the script seamlessly. "Grief can do strange things to people. Maybe you need to talk to someone, a professional." I listened to their performance without interrupting, noting how smoothly they passed accusations between them, how carefully they had coordinated their attack. Selfishness, senility, betrayal. The words were designed to make me defensive, to force me into explanations and justifications that would only dig me deeper into whatever trap they had prepared. When they finished, I turned to Ryan. "Do you believe what they're saying, that I've lost my mind?" Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, I just think we need to talk about what's happening. The house, the money, it affects all of us." "Does it?" I leaned forward slightly. "Tell me something, Ryan. Do you know who's been paying $800 every month toward your mortgage for the past 10 years? The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Ryan's brow furrowed in confusion. Vanessa's eyes flashed with something that looked very much like panic. "What are you talking about?" Ryan asked. $800 every month for 10 years. Automatic transfer from my account to yours, covering the gap between what you could afford and what the bank required. I kept my voice steady, factual, allowing the numbers to speak for themselves. "That's $96,000, Ryan. $96,000 I've paid to keep the roof over your head. Money from my pension, from your mother's life insurance, from savings we set aside for our retirement." Ryan stared at me, then turned slowly toward Vanessa. "You told me Dad stopped helping years ago. You said he was too cheap to contribute, that he'd abandoned us financially after Mom died." Vanessa's composure cracked visibly. "That's not I never said. You're misunderstanding what I meant." "What exactly did you mean?" Ryan's voice had an edge I had never heard before. "The finances are complicated. I handle all our accounts, and sometimes the details get confused. If your father was sending money, it must have been going to a different account, or maybe I thought it was something else." $800 a month for 10 years, I repeated quietly. "That's not something you accidentally overlook, Vanessa." Diane attempted to intervene. "This is exactly what we were talking about, Arthur. You're creating conflict, turning Ryan against his own wife with these accusations." "I'm stating facts," I replied. "Bank records don't lie. I have every statement, every transfer, every penny documented. Your daughter has been telling Ryan that I abandoned him financially while simultaneously accepting my money every single month. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a deliberate deception." The room fell silent. Ryan was looking at Vanessa with an expression I had never seen on his face before, not anger exactly, but something perhaps more dangerous. Doubt. The foundation of absolute trust that Vanessa had spent 15 years building was showing its first visible crack. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, but Ryan held up his hand. Just don't say anything else right now." I rose from my chair, gathering my coat. There was nothing more I needed to accomplish today. The seed had been planted, and it would grow on its own. "I'm going to leave now," I said. "But Ryan, when you're ready to hear more, I have things to tell you. Things your mother left behind. Things she wanted you to know." I walked out without waiting for a response, my heart pounding but my steps steady. As I reached my car, I allowed myself a single thought. This is just the beginning. Wait until they hear what Eleanor left behind. That night, I finally opened Eleanor's box. I sat at my desk with the curtains drawn and the house silent around me, the wooden box resting before me like a sacred object. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the brass latch and raised the lid for the first time in 3 years. The smell that rose from inside was faintly familiar lavender, the scent Eleanor had always worn, as if she had deliberately perfumed the contents so that opening the box would feel like being embraced by her one more time. Inside, I found 3 items arranged with the careful precision that had characterized everything Eleanor did. A handwritten letter several pages long, folded neatly and addressed to me. A USB drive, small and black, labeled simply "Listen," and a notarized document bearing official stamps and signatures I did not immediately recognize. I reached for the letter first, my fingers trembling as I unfolded the pages covered in Eleanor's graceful handwriting. "My dearest Arthur," she began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have finally reached the point I always knew you would reach. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you these things while I was alive. You wouldn't have believed me, and trying to convince you would only have pushed you further into denial. Some truths can only be accepted when we discover them ourselves. So I gathered the evidence and left it for you, trusting that one day you would need it and be ready to receive it." I paused, taking a breath, then continued reading. After Vanessa joined our family, I began noticing things that troubled me. The way she looked at our home, our savings, our future, not with love but with calculation. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was simply a protective mother struggling to share my son. But the feeling never went away. So I did something I never told you about. I investigated her family. My heart began pounding harder as I read the next paragraph. What I found horrified me, Arthur. 10 years ago, before Vanessa married Ryan, she and Diane manipulated Diane's own mother, Vanessa's grandmother, out of her home and her savings. Her name was Margaret Collins. She was 78 years old, a widow living alone, trusting her daughter to help manage her affairs. They convinced her to sign over power of attorney, then systematically drained her accounts and sold her house while she was still living in it. When she finally realized what was happening, they had her declared mentally incompetent. She died alone in a state facility 18 months later, with nothing to her name. Her own daughter and granddaughter took everything she had and laughed about it afterward. I set the letter down, my hands shaking too badly to hold the paper steady. The notarized document suddenly made sense. It must be records from the grandmother's case, proof of what Eleanor had discovered. But the USB drive, the recording. "Listen," the label said. I retrieved my laptop, inserted the drive, and clicked on the single audio file it contained. Vanessa's voice filled the room, casual and confident, clearly unaware she was being recorded. Grandma was so easy. She trusted everyone. By the time she realized what happened, she couldn't even remember her own name. We had everything signed and sealed before she even knew to ask questions. Then Diane's voice, laughing softly. "That's the trick with old people. They're too proud to admit they've been fooled. They'll deny it even to themselves, because accepting the truth would mean accepting that their own family betrayed them. By the time they're willing to face it, it's too late. Everything's already gone. We just have to be patient with Arthur," Vanessa continued. "He's healthy now, but he won't live forever. And once he's gone, everything will be ours. Ryan won't question anything I tell him. He never does." The recording ended. Silence filled the room, broken only by my own ragged breathing. I returned to Eleanor's letter, reading the final paragraphs through a blur of tears. "They're planning to do the same thing to you, Arthur. I've heard them talking when they thought I was asleep or too sick to understand. They're waiting for you to die, and if you take too long, they'll find ways to speed up the process, not physically but legally. They'll claim you're incompetent, take control of your affairs, drain everything we built together. I couldn't stop them while I was alive. I was too sick, and you wouldn't have believed me if I'd told you. But I could leave you the proof. I could make sure that when you finally saw the truth, you would have weapons to defend yourself. Use them when you're ready, my love. Protect yourself. Live the life you deserve. And know that I love you forever and always. Eleanor." I sat in silence for a long time, the letter resting in my lap, tears streaming down my face. Not tears of sadness, though grief was part of what I felt. These were tears of awe, of overwhelming gratitude, of love so profound it transcended death itself. Eleanor had known. She had seen the danger, investigated it, documented it, and prepared my defense while cancer stole her breath and her strength. She had spent her dying weeks not in fear for herself, but in determination to protect me from what she knew was coming. You protected me even after death, I whispered to her photograph. You saw everything. You prepared everything. Now I understand. I pressed the letter to my chest, breathing in the faint trace of lavender that still clung to the paper. You never left me at all. A week later, I invited Ryan to visit me in Vermont. Just Ryan, no one else. I told him I had something to show him that could not be discussed over the phone or in his house, where Vanessa might overhear. He hesitated. I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, but something had shifted in him since the confrontation about the mortgage payments. The crack I had seen forming in his trust had continued to widen, and curiosity was winning against the loyalty Vanessa had cultivated for so long. He arrived on a Saturday morning, driving up the gravel road in his sedan, looking around at the lake and the trees with an expression of confused wonder. I watched him from the porch, this man who was once the baby I cradled, the boy I taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager I guided through heartbreak and triumph. Somewhere along the way I had lost him to a woman who saw him as a tool rather than a partner. Perhaps today I could begin to get him back. We sat in the cottage's small living room, a fire crackling in the stone fireplace, 2 cups of coffee growing cold on the table between us. I did not ease into the conversation or soften what I was about to reveal. Ryan deserved the truth delivered directly, without manipulation or emotional padding. Your mother left me something before she died, I said. Evidence she gathered during her final months. I want you to see it and hear it for yourself. I handed him Eleanor's letter first. He read it slowly, his face growing paler with each paragraph. When he reached the part about Vanessa's grandmother, about what had been done to that poor woman, his hands began to shake. This can't be true, he whispered. Vanessa never mentioned any of this. She told me her grandmother died peacefully, that they were close. Listen to the recording, I said. I played the audio file from my laptop, watching Ryan's face as his wife's voice filled the room. Vanessa laughing about how easy her grandmother had been to manipulate. Diane joking about the pride of old people preventing them from admitting they had been fooled. And then Vanessa's casual prediction about my own future, about waiting for me to die, about Ryan never questioning anything she told him. The sound of his own name in that context seemed to break something inside him. Ryan doubled over, his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders shook with sobs he tried desperately to contain. That's her voice, he said when he could finally speak. That's Vanessa. I know her voice. I can't pretend it's someone else or that it's been edited or faked. That's my wife talking about exploiting an old woman, her own grandmother. I let him process in silence. There was nothing I could say that would make this easier. The truth was doing its own work, and my interference would only complicate it. After several minutes, Ryan looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I noticed things, he said quietly. Over the years, small things I told myself didn't matter. Money that disappeared from accounts Vanessa managed. Explanations that didn't quite add up. The way she talked about you when she thought I wasn't paying attention. He shook his head. I was too afraid to question anything. She made me feel like asking questions meant I didn't trust her, and not trusting her meant our marriage was failing. So I stopped asking. I stopped looking. I just let her handle everything and told myself it was easier that way. It's not your fault, I said. People like Vanessa are skilled at what they do. They choose partners they can control and then spend years making sure that control feels like love. Ryan wiped his face, with his sleeve struggling to compose himself. Dad, what are you going to do with the recordings? Are you going to the police? Are you going to expose her publicly? I considered the question carefully before answering. Nothing. He looked up surprised. Nothing. The truth doesn't need me to weaponize it, I said. It just needs to exist. Vanessa knows now that I have this evidence. She knows that at any moment I could share it with anyone, family, friends, authorities. That knowledge will eat at her every single day. She'll never know when or if the hammer might fall. I paused, letting the words settle. What happens next is up to her, and up to you. Ryan stared at the fire for a long moment. You're giving me a choice. I'm giving you information. What you do with it is your decision. I'm not asking you to leave her. I'm not demanding you choose between your wife and your father. I'm only asking you to see her clearly, perhaps for the first time. What kind of life you want to build with that clarity is entirely up to you. He nodded slowly, the weight of everything he had learned pressing down on his shoulders. I need time to think. Take all the time you need, I said. I'm not going anywhere. Ryan returned home to Colorado that evening, and I did not hear from him for nearly 2 weeks. I understood his silence. The weight of what he had learned required time to process decisions, to consider a lifetime of assumptions to reevaluate. I busied myself with settling into the Vermont cottage, arranging furniture, stocking the kitchen, learning the rhythms of a place that was entirely my own. Maggie stopped by occasionally with fresh bread or vegetables from her winter greenhouse, and her quiet companionship reminded me that solitude did not have to mean loneliness. When Ryan finally called, his voice sounded different. Harder somehow, but also clearer, as if a fog had lifted from his mind. "Dad, I need to tell you something. I've been going through our household finances, all of it. Bank accounts, credit cards, investment statements. Things Vanessa always insisted on handling herself." He paused, and I heard him take a shaky breath. "I found something I don't understand. There are credit card statements coming to our house addressed to you. 4 different accounts. I've never seen them before because Vanessa always gets the mail first, but I intercepted them this week." A cold weight settled in my stomach. Credit cards in my name, yes. 4 of them. The statements show purchases going back 3 years. Clothes, jewelry, spa treatments, things I know Vanessa bought because I've seen her wearing them or heard her talk about the appointments. "But the bills are in your name, Dad. Your name, your social security number, our address." I closed my eyes, the implications washing over me. Identity theft. My own daughter-in-law had opened credit accounts using my personal information and had been charging her lifestyle to my name for years. The audacity of it was almost impressive if it had not been so devastating. "Did you confront her?" I asked. "Yes." She denied it at first. Said she had no idea what I was talking about, that maybe the statements were sent to the wrong address by mistake. When I showed her the account details, she changed her story. Said you must have opened the accounts yourself and forgotten about them. Told me that elderly people often lose track of their finances and that I shouldn't upset you by bringing it up. And you believed her? No. Ryan's voice was firm. I don't believe anything she says anymore, Dad. Not after what I heard in those recordings. Not after what Mom wrote in her letter. Vanessa's been lying to me for years about everything, and I was too weak to see it. After we hung up, I called Samuel and explained what Ryan had discovered. Samuel immediately recommended that I request a full credit report from all 3 major bureaus. The results arrived within days, delivered electronically to my laptop, and what they revealed made the situation even worse than I had feared. 4 credit cards opened over the past 3 years, all using my name, my social security number, and Ryan's home address as the billing location. Total outstanding balance $42,000. Minimum payments had been made just often enough to keep the accounts active and avoid triggering fraud alerts, but the debt had accumulated steadily, month after month, purchase after purchase. Classic identity theft, executed with patience and precision by someone who had access to all my personal information through family connection. I sat with the evidence for a long time, considering my options. I could go to the police. Identity theft was a felony in Colorado, carrying potential prison time and permanent criminal record. Vanessa could lose everything: her freedom, her reputation, her marriage, her relationship with her son. Part of me wanted that. Part of me wanted to watch her suffer the consequences of her cruelty in the most public and permanent way possible. But another part of me remembered Eleanor's letter, her gentle wisdom about the kind of man she believed me to be. Revenge was not the same as justice. Destruction was not the same as freedom. If I sent Vanessa to prison, I would spend years entangled in court proceedings and testimony, reliving every betrayal, keeping the wound open indefinitely. She would become the center of my life in a new and poisonous way, and I would never truly escape her shadow. Instead, I chose a different path. I filed disputes with all 3 credit bureaus, reporting the accounts as fraudulent and providing documentation that I had never applied for or authorized any of them. I submitted affidavits, froze my credit to prevent future abuse, and created a paper trail that would follow Vanessa for the rest of her financial life. The credit card companies would investigate, and when they confirmed the fraud, they would close the accounts and potentially pursue their own legal action against the person who had opened them. The system would do its work without requiring me to become an instrument of vengeance. Samuel reviewed my approach and offered his assessment during a phone call the following week. "You understand what you're giving up," he said. "You could destroy her with this. Felony charges, prison time, complete annihilation of everything she's built. The evidence is overwhelming. No prosecutor would hesitate to take this case." "I know," I replied, "and you're choosing not to pursue it. I'm choosing not to be the one who destroys her. There's a difference." I paused, gathering my thoughts. I don't want destruction, Samuel. I want freedom. I want to live the rest of my life without Vanessa occupying space in my mind. If I press charges, I become her adversary in a legal battle that could drag on for years. If I let the system handle the fraud through normal channels, I remove myself from the equation entirely. She'll know you have the evidence. She'll know you could have ended her. Exactly. I looked out the window at the frozen lake, peaceful and still in the winter light. Let her live with that knowledge. Let her wake up every morning wondering if today is the day I change my mind. Let her spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for a hammer that may never fall. That's a heavier punishment than any prison sentence, Samuel. Prisons have release dates. The fear of what I might do will follow her forever. There was a long silence on the line before Samuel spoke again. Eleanor was right about you. She said you'd find your own way through this and it wouldn't look like anyone expected. I smiled faintly. She usually was right. About most things. Spring came slowly to Vermont, the ice on the lake retreating in patches, the bare trees showing the first faint blush of budding leaves. I had been living in the cottage for 3 months by then, settling into routines that felt increasingly natural. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks along the shoreline, evenings spent reading by the fire or talking with Maggie about everything and nothing. The peace I had hoped to find here had proven real, not a fantasy constructed from desperation, but a genuine possibility I was learning to inhabit. Ryan arrived unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, his car pulling into my driveway with the hesitant approach of someone uncertain of their welcome. I watched him through the window as he sat behind the wheel for several minutes, gathering courage or composing thoughts, before finally stepping out and walking toward my door. He looked older than he had just weeks ago, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with physical burden. I opened the door before he could knock. "Come in," I said simply. He followed me inside without speaking, his eyes moving around the cottage as if seeing it for the first time, though he had been here before when I showed him Eleanor's evidence. I gestured toward the armchair by the fireplace and took my own seat across from him, waiting for him to find his words. "Vanessa moved out," he said finally. "She's staying with her mother. We're filing for separation and probably divorce after that. The credit card fraud investigation is ongoing. The companies are pursuing recovery, and her name is flagged in their systems now. She can't open new accounts anywhere." He paused, swallowing hard. "Tyler knows something is wrong, but I haven't told him the details yet. I don't know how to explain any of this to a 16-year-old. I nodded, offering no commentary. This was his story to tell, his pain to process. "Dad, I came here to ask for your forgiveness." Ryan's voice cracked on the last word. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I failed you in ways I'm only beginning to understand, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. For the years of silence, for letting Vanessa control how I treated you, for choosing comfort over loyalty. I was weak, and my weakness hurt you, and I will regret that for the rest of my life." The words hung in the air between us, sincere and desperate and wholly inadequate. I studied my son's face, seeing the boy I had raised beneath the man he had become, and I felt the familiar pull of parental love urging me to embrace him, to tell him everything was forgiven, to restore the relationship we had lost with a single gesture of unconditional acceptance. But I could not do that. Not yet. Perhaps not ever in the way he was hoping. "Ryan, I love you," I said slowly. "I have always loved you from the moment you were born to this very second. Nothing you have done or failed to do has changed that love. It is permanent and unconditional, and will remain so until I draw my last breath." Relief began to soften his features, but I continued before he could respond. "But love doesn't erase 10 years of silence. Love doesn't undo the Christmas dinners where I was seated in corners and spoken about like I wasn't in the room. Love doesn't heal the wound of hearing your wife tell your mother-in-law that she was waiting for me to die. Love doesn't compensate for $96,000 paid to keep a roof over your head while you never once said thank you." I kept my voice gentle but firm, speaking truth without cruelty. "I forgave you the moment I heard Vanessa's voice on those recordings, because I understood then that you were a victim too in your own way. But forgiveness is not the same as restoration. The relationship we had is gone. If we're going to build something new, it has to be built honestly, slowly, with full acknowledgement of what was broken." Ryan's eyes filled with tears. "What can I do? Tell me what to do, Dad. Tell me how to fix this." I considered the question carefully before answering. "You can become the man your mother believed you could be. Not for me, not to earn my approval or repair my feelings. For yourself, because it's the right way to live, because it honors her memory, because your son is watching you and learning what kind of man he should become." I leaned forward slightly. "That's not something I can give you, Ryan. It's not a gift I can bestow or a debt I can forgive into existence. You have to earn it, day by day, choice by choice for the rest of your life." He wiped his face with the back of his hand, nodding slowly. "I don't know if I can." "You can. Your mother always believed you had it in you. She saw strength in you that you've never fully accessed, potential you've never fully realized. She wrote about it, actually." Ryan looked up confused. I rose and walked to my desk, retrieving a cream-colored envelope I had kept separate from Eleanor's other materials. It was addressed to Ryan in Eleanor's handwriting, sealed and untouched, since she had given it to Samuel along with the box meant for me. "She wrote this for you," I said, handing him the envelope. "It was in the box with everything else, but it was clearly meant for you alone. I never opened it. I never read it. Whatever she wanted to say to you is between you and her." Ryan took the envelope with trembling hands, staring at his mother's handwriting as if seeing a ghost. He ran his fingers over the letters of his name, written by a hand that had been still for 3 years now, preserved in ink and paper like a voice frozen in time. "Mom wrote this 2 weeks before she died. She prepared letters for both of us, along with the evidence. She knew this day would come, Ryan. She knew you would need to hear from her directly, not through me, not filtered through my interpretation. Whatever is in that envelope is her voice speaking to you." Ryan carefully broke the seal, his fingers clumsy with emotion, and withdrew several pages of his mother's familiar handwriting. I watched his eyes begin to move across the words, watched the color drain from his face, watched his expression shift from apprehension to pain to something deeper and more complex than I could name. He read in silence for several minutes. When he reached the second page, his jaw tightened. By the third page, tears were streaming freely down his cheeks. When he finally finished and looked up, his face was crumbled, broken open in a way I had never seen before. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She knew. She knew everything. She knew what I was becoming, and she still loved me anyway. She still believed I could be better. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Whatever Eleanor had written to our son had cut deeper than anything I could have offered, reaching places my words could never touch. She had always understood Ryan better than I did, had always known exactly what he needed to hear. Even in death, she was still his mother, still guiding him, still believing in him when he could not believe in himself. Ryan clutched the letter to his chest and wept. A year passed and the world kept turning. The Vermont cottage became home in ways I had not anticipated when I first saw that listing online. The rhythms of the seasons marked my days now, spring rains that swelled the lake and brought wildflowers to the meadow, summer evenings spent on the dock, watching fireflies dance over the water, autumn transforming the maples into cathedrals, of gold and crimson, winter settling its quiet white blanket over everything and teaching me the value of stillness. I learned the names of birds that visited my feeders, recognized the patterns of deer that crossed my property at dusk, came to know this land as intimately as I had once known the streets of Colorado. Maggie remained my closest companion through all of it. Our friendship had deepened into something rare and precious, the kind of bond that only forms between people who have survived similar storms and emerged with matching scars. We gardened together in the warmer months, her expertise guiding my amateur attempts at growing tomatoes and herbs. We cooked meals in each other's kitchens, trading recipes and stories over glasses of wine. We walked the paths around the lake in all weather, sometimes talking for hours, sometimes sharing comfortable silence that required no words to fill it. There was no romance between us, and neither of us sought any. We had both loved deeply in our marriages and lost those loves to death. What we found in each other was different companionship without complication, understanding without expectation, friendship rooted in mutual respect and the shared knowledge of what it meant to rebuild a life from wreckage. Some evenings, sitting on my porch watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of orange and pink, I felt a contentment I had not believed possible during those dark years of being forgotten. 6 months into my new life, I established the Eleanor Bennett Foundation for Forgotten Elders. The idea had grown slowly from conversations with Maggie and Samuel, from memories of Eleanor's determination to protect me from the recognition that my story was not unique. Across America, countless elderly people were being exploited by their own families, manipulated out of savings, isolated from support systems, declared incompetent by relatives eager to seize control of their assets. Most of them suffered in silence too, ashamed to admit they had been victimized by people they loved. The foundation started small, operating out of a rented office space in Burlington with a staff of 3, a retired attorney who handled legal consultations, a social worker who provided emotional support and resource navigation, and an administrator who kept everything organized. I funded the initial operations from my savings, and Samuel helped recruit pro bono lawyers willing to take cases involving elder exploitation. Our mission was simple: to provide the kind of protection Eleanor had left for me, to anyone who needed it, to ensure that no elderly person had to face family betrayal alone. My story became the Foundation's founding narrative. I shared it in interviews with local newspapers and presentations to community groups and fundraising letters sent to potential donors. The response surprised me. People wrote from across New England with their own experiences: a widow whose stepchildren had forged her signature on property documents, a retired teacher whose son had drained her retirement accounts, a veteran whose daughter had taken out loans in his name. Each letter confirmed what I had come to understand. The abuse I experienced was not an aberration but a pattern, a quiet epidemic hidden behind closed doors and family loyalty. News of Vanessa filtered back to me through Ryan, who called regularly, now our conversations gradually rebuilding the connection we had lost. The credit fraud investigation had expanded beyond my accounts, uncovering additional schemes and falsified documents that painted a picture of systematic financial deception spanning years. Her reputation in their Colorado community was destroyed, whispered about at school events and neighborhood gatherings, marked forever as the woman who stole from her own father-in-law. Diane had distanced herself completely when the investigation began, claiming she knew nothing about any of it, throwing her daughter under the bus to protect her own image. The mother-daughter partnership that had exploited Vanessa's grandmother and targeted me had dissolved the moment accountability arrived. Ryan filed for legal separation 8 months after Vanessa moved out. The divorce proceedings were ongoing, complicated by questions of marital assets and debts. Tyler had chosen to live primarily with his father, a decision that spoke volumes about what the boy had observed and concluded on his own. Vanessa lost everything. She had schemed so patiently to gain the house was being sold to settle debts. Her social standing was in ruins. Her own mother had abandoned her, and her family had fractured beyond repair. I felt no triumph in her downfall. That surprised me at first. I had expected to savor her suffering, to find satisfaction in watching karma deliver the justice I had declined to pursue myself. Instead, I felt only a quiet peace, a sense of natural order restored without requiring my participation. Speaking with Samuel about it one afternoon, I found words for what I was experiencing. I didn't punish her, I said. The truth did. I just stopped protecting her from it. For years, my silence and Ryan's willful blindness had shielded Vanessa from consequences. We had enabled her manipulations by refusing to see them, had funded her schemes by never questioning them, had allowed her cruelty to flourish by absorbing it without complaint. When I finally stepped aside, when I stopped paying the mortgage, stopped accepting mistreatment, stopped pretending everything was fine, the structure of lies she had built collapsed under its own weight. I did not push it over. I simply stopped holding it up. That understanding brought me more peace than revenge ever could have. On the morning of October 14th, I woke to my 68th birthday. Another year completed, another year beginning, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I looked forward to what lay ahead. Maggie had promised to bring over a cake that afternoon, and Samuel was driving up for a small dinner celebration. The day stretched before me, full of possibility rather than dread. I was making coffee when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number, a Colorado area code I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was a telemarketer or wrong number, but something made me answer. "Hello," a young voice, hesitant but determined. "Grandpa, it's Tyler." My heart stopped for a moment, then resumed beating faster than before. "I know we haven't talked in years," he continued, the words tumbling out as if he had rehearsed them many times. "I know things have been complicated with Mom and everything that happened. But I found your number, and I've been wanting to call for months, and I wanted to ask you something." "Of course, Tyler. You can ask me anything." A pause, a breath. Then, "Can I come see you? I want to know the real story. I want to know who you really are. And I want to know about Grandma Eleanor." Will you tell me about her? Tyler arrived 3 days later, driving himself in a used Honda he told me he had bought with money saved from summer jobs. I watched him pull into the driveway, this young man I barely knew, despite sharing his blood, and I saw echoes of Ryan at that age, mixed with something else entirely, a directness in his eyes, a set to his jaw that reminded me powerfully of Eleanor. He stepped out of the car and stood for a moment looking at the cottage, the lake, the trees just beginning to turn gold with early autumn. Then he walked toward me with the determined stride of someone who had traveled a long way to find answers and intended to get them. "Grandpa," he said, and the word sounded foreign and precious all at once. "Tyler, come inside." We sat in the living room where I had once shown his father the evidence of his mother's betrayals. I offered coffee, which he declined, and water, which he accepted. For several minutes we simply looked at each other, bridging the gap of years and silence with mutual examination. "Mom always said you were difficult," Tyler began, his voice steady, despite his obvious nervousness. "She said you abandoned us, that you cared more about money than family, that you hurt Dad by leaving Colorado. That was the story I grew up with. That's what I believed until about 6 months ago." "What changed 6 months ago?" Tyler pulled out his phone and navigated to something on the screen. "I found Grandma Eleanor's old Facebook page. It's still up, you know. Nobody ever took it down. I spent weeks reading through her posts, her comments, her photos. She wrote about you constantly, Grandpa. She wrote about you like you were her hero. Arthur fixed the fence today and wouldn't let me help even though his back was hurting. 40 years married, and he still brings me flowers every Friday. My husband is the most patient man alive, and I don't deserve him." He looked up from the phone, his eyes searching my face. That didn't sound like the person Mom described, so I wanted to know the real story. I wanted to know which version was true. I considered how to respond. The temptation existed to tell him everything, to paint his mother as the villain she had proven herself to be, to ensure his loyalty by destroying his remaining illusions. But that was not the man Eleanor had believed me to be, and it was not the grandfather I wanted Tyler to know. "Your mother and I had serious disagreements," I said carefully. "She made choices I couldn't accept, and I made choices she couldn't forgive. The details are complicated and painful, and some of them aren't mine to share. What I can tell you is this. I loved your grandmother more than I knew it was possible to love another person. I tried to be a good father to Ryan even when I failed, and I never ever stopped caring about you, Tyler, even during the years when I wasn't allowed to show it. But you didn't abandon us, no. I removed myself from a situation that was causing me harm. There's a difference, though. I understand why it might not have looked that way from your perspective." Tyler nodded, slowly processing. "Dad told me some of it. Not everything, but enough. He said Grandma Eleanor left you something that proved Mom wasn't who she pretended to be. He said you could have destroyed her, but chose not to." "The truth isn't a weapon," I replied. "It's just the truth. What people do with it is their own choice." We talked for hours after that. I told him about Eleanor, how we met, how we built our life together, how she faced her illness with grace I could never match. I told him about my career, the bridges and highways that still carried travelers across Colorado. I told him about finding this cottage, about Maggie's friendship, about the foundation and its work helping elders like myself. I let him draw his own conclusions about the gaps in my narrative, the spaces where his mother's actions spoke for themselves without requiring my condemnation. When Maggie arrived with a birthday cake, and Samuel pulled up shortly after, Tyler asked if he could stay for dinner. The four of us gathered around my small table, 2 old friends, a family attorney who had kept my wife's secrets for 3 years, and a grandson I was only beginning to know, and shared a meal that felt more like family than any Christmas dinner I had endured in Ryan's house. The phone rang as we were finishing dessert. Ryan's name appeared on the screen, and I excused myself to answer. "Dad." His voice was cautious but not hostile. "Tyler texted me. He's there, isn't he?" "He is. He drove up to see me." A long pause. "What did you tell him?" "The truth about your mother, the truth about me. Nothing that wasn't his right to know, and nothing designed to turn him against anyone." Another pause, and when Ryan spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Dad, thank you for not turning him against us." "I would never," I said. "He's your son. And he's Eleanor's grandson. That's enough." After dinner, after Samuel had driven back to Burlington and Maggie had returned to her cottage, Tyler and I sat on the porch watching stars emerge over the lake. He asked me what I wanted for my birthday, and I told him the truth. Nothing. I already have everything I need. He looked confused the way young people do when they cannot imagine contentment without accumulation. He would understand someday, I hoped. He would learn what I had taken 68 years to discover. 68 years old. I spent most of them giving to my work, my family, my son. I thought sacrifice was love. Eleanor knew better. She knew that kindness without boundaries is just an invitation to be used. I don't have a mansion. I don't have millions. I have a cottage by a lake, a friend who understands silence, and a grandson who wanted to know the truth badly enough to find me. Eleanor's photograph sits on my mantel now next to the window that looks out over the water. Sometimes when the light hits it just right, I swear she's smiling. Happiness isn't what you collect. It's what you're finally brave enough to let go. Happy birthday to me. At last, Arthur Bennett's story reminds us of a truth we often forget. Love without boundaries is not love at all, but an invitation to be taken for granted. For years, Arthur gave everything to his family, asking nothing in return, believing that sacrifice alone would earn him the respect and gratitude he deserved. It took losing everything, including the wife who saw the danger before he did, for Arthur to finally understand that protecting yourself is not selfishness, it is survival. Eleanor's gift from beyond the grave was not just evidence or documentation, it was permission. Permission for Arthur to stop carrying people who refused to walk beside him. Permission to build a life defined by peace rather than obligation. Permission to believe that 67 years old was not too late to start over. Today, Arthur lives in his cottage by the lake, surrounded by friends who value him, doing work that honors Eleanor's memory, and rebuilding a relationship with a grandson who chose truth over comfortable lies. Vanessa lost everything she schemed to gain, not because Arthur destroyed her, but because the truth has a way of finding daylight when good people stop hiding it. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below telling us what you think Arthur should do next, or share your own experience with family members who took your kindness for granted. Your story matters, and this community is here to listen. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story of survival, justice, and the quiet courage it takes to finally put yourself first.